All right, let's get started. Good evening. Hello, greetings, everybody. Hope folks are doing well. My name is Hamid Khan with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and welcome to the coalition's Power Not Paranoia Zoom series. This is our 22nd webinar. Since we started holding these webinars, we typically, and this is in lieu of our in-person meetings, which happened for several years every Tuesday in downtown Los Angeles in Skid Row at our home at LA Can. And since March 22nd, because of COVID, we decided that we will move into Zoom and maintain our ability to continue building, to do knowledge exchange and organize, build collective power. So hence, every Tuesday, if you are kind of bored, join us from 6 to 8 p.m. There's some amazing conversations, a lot of strategic thinking, a lot of knowledge exchange, a lot of thoughts exchanged as well. The first Tuesday deals with the intersection of state violence, the police state, and gender and sexuality. So, for example, this month's first Tuesday meeting, we had friends from Bogota, Colombia, who are trans sex workers who have been organizing on the streets and using art and theater to do community outreach and fight back against law enforcement and policing. The second Tuesday is committed to the war on youth, where we've been looking at the intersection of the police state and how increasingly the youth and the criminalization of youth is taking increasingly a national security language around radicalization and extremism, and how, where our fight is as we fight back things like gang injunctions and gang databases. The state continues to come up with new and more type of designations: chronic offenders, violent extremists, this, that, and the other. The third Tuesday, which is today, is dedicated to a political moment and general conversations as to where we are, to bring it together collectively, and then to talk about issues that we face and what is the role of the coalition in all of this. And then the fourth Tuesday, which will be next Tuesday and we'll announce, is dedicated to more working and programmatic stuff around data-driven policing, around the architecture of surveillance and all of that. So we also have been doing our Surveillance 101 teach-ins as well. So we've had 3 Surveillance 101 teach-ins. So every second and fourth Thursday is committed to that. So we're staying busy, a lot moving, a lot happening. And I'm just super happy to be in just a company of amazing folks. So today our conversation is about the current political moment around the budgeting process. And today we actually had an action this morning as well outside the mayor's house, and calling the mayor out and basically demanding the mayor to take action, but also calling out the shenanigans, the sleight of hands that has been going on, through this whole process. We've seen, this is day 85 today, since those horrible and traumatic 8 minutes and 46 seconds when George Floyd was murdered or lynched, or however we want to look at it, publicly on camera. And since then, we've seen the rise of one of the largest movements, grassroots movements in the history of the United States, where thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people all across the globe, and millions of people all across the globe have marched. Just in the United States, there were estimates that these actions were happening in close to 500 cities. We've had our own in Los Angeles as well. So within that, of course, the demands for abolition and the demands for defunding of the police were the primary pieces, and I think we can collectively hopefully agree that the ground has definitely shifted. The ground has shifted, the political landscape has shifted, and it was a beautiful moment for some of us who've been involved in movement building for many years to see just the autonomous actions and the autonomous movement building, and the way young people especially were really calling it out. And young people, and especially not just the language around, sometimes, the vanguardy language around Marxism and Leninism and capitalism and all of that. But one thing is very clear, that this is unacceptable. this system is not working, and we are organizing to dismantle and abolish this system. So today our plan is to look at where LA is. How do we what improvements or advances have we made or not? How are we looking at some of the conversations around the defunding of LAPD, whether there was a mockery of our demands or whether that defunding is really happening or not? We're going to look at how do we continue to popularize through art and theater and culture the conversation around abolition and around defunding of the police as well, and where everybody's at. So there's a group of folks who are going to start this conversation. And just for logistics, you may have seen that folks have been when you joined up that you were muted, and there's a reason why folks are muted, because we've had our a little bit of share of Zoom bombing. So that's where people are not able to unmute themselves. When we open it up for collective conversation, then we'll give it a shot and see where things are. Also, the chat is where we won't be able to chat with everybody. So the chat is directed to the hosts and the co-hosts, so any messages and anything. So please feel free to ask any questions, make any comments. And if you are on the phone, and if you've dialed in by phone, please text us at 562-230-4578, 562-230-4578. So maybe we can start off the conversation with just go ahead, Akhil or Sophie or Alexis and Jamie and Jackie, just what the coalition has been doing as to, and just like what are the very different ways that we have been doing a deep dive and approaching the budget as well, and what has been some of our focus. And Jackie, I'm going to just go ahead and make you a co-host as well, so you can unmute and mute yourself whenever you want to. So let's get that conversation going, and I want to let folks know that this is being recorded. It's going to be uploaded on our website in the next couple of days, so all the previous 21 webinars are available on the website and the Surveillance 101 teach-ins. So let's roll. Let's get going. Anybody who wants to go? And go ahead.
Maybe what we could start off with, my name is Akhil and I'm part of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I think that our work on the budget is really part of a larger citywide, extremely important movement based on this political moment, which is part of a longer continuation of history. And I think that one thing that I would love to know, so we have on this call Virginia from the People's Budget team, as well as Black Lives Matter. And Virginia, would you be able to share with us a little bit of the context and the history of the People's Budget movement and some of your experiences organizing that, and some of the things that, insights you can share for everyone here about that process?
Yes, thank you so much, Akhil, and thank you so much, Hamid, for inviting me into this conversation. This is such important work, and I think it's really important to connect this idea of defunding to the conversation around police surveillance and the ways in which police surveillance actually is deeply expensive, and the conversation that we're hearing often being perpetuated by the sheriffs and the LAPDL and pro-police forces is that, oh, we need all this money in order to keep us safe. But there are a number of things that the police are ill-equipped to handle, and things perpetuating a culture of violence against all of our communities that are being actively funded with our taxpayer dollars. And with that being said, the People's Budget is an effort that has actually been in the makings for about 5 years now. For 5 years, BLM has been protesting the fact that Mayor Garcetti allocates each year about 50% of our general funds to policing. It comes in many different forms, but ultimately, the overwhelming majority of the money that we spend is on policing in this city, which deeply eats into resources, that are desperately needed by our Black and Brown communities. And so BLM has been having this conversation for years, and this year was different in that we have this unparalleled crisis, this kind of unprecedented moment of COVID-19. And so as a response to that, BLM, along with about 55 in total other Black Los Angeles-based groups, got together and created a document called the Black LA Demands, which were a set of demands in response to COVID, both short-term and long-term, that would begin to create the kind of meaningful change that the city should have implemented in response to Watts, and never did. And so, unfortunately, those demands went completely ignored by City Council. They didn't even bother to respond, because that's how much respect the City Council has for Black people. I think we need to be very honest about what that articulates. And so eventually what happened was the people's budget was conceived, because ultimately we saw that the City Council wasn't going to reallocate these funds. And so this participatory budgeting process was birthed to get an accounting of what the people of Los Angeles actually wanted to see money being allocated towards. And what we saw was that the residents of Los Angeles only wanted to allocate about 1.64% of policing, as opposed to Garcetti's 54% of the budget to policing. So it's very clear that the disparities between the ways in which the city wants to allocate our funds and the ways in which we see our needs being neglected by the city are in deep tension with one another. And so ultimately, there was kind of there hadn't been traction initially. There was a huge response from community, and there were over 24,000 respondents, which we like to put that in perspective by saying that's about the same number of respondents as CNN's 2016 exit polling. So the response was enormous. But it took this moment, the collective response of people's grief and anger in the wake of George Floyd's killing, for people to really start to pay attention to these calls to defunding police. Because the call to defund police is not just, it's not a call to lawlessness, it's not a call for anarchy, but it is really a response to the ways in which policing has gutted our communities for years, both through their harmful and racist practices, but also the spending on police has drained the resources that should be allocated to community. And so we were able, through a valiant fight, to get Garcetti to commit to reducing the police budget by $150 million, which we know is mere pennies when you're looking at $3.1 billion in total police spending. But we're seeing that even as Garcetti had committed to that, he had already been working on chartering this community safety bureau, which will ultimately cost a lot more money than the $150 million that he's defunded. And also some of the city council members who have committed to reimagining public safety are also involved in those conversations. And so that's something that we also need to name and lift up as we talk about the ways in which our politicians claim to want to be moving forward with us and are also then complicit in these systems that are actively harming us. So in this moment, I think it's really just important for us to kind of have that context as we talk about the intersection of policing and the ways in which our communities are really being terrorized by the creation of a police state that has been normalized. We really need to start to reframe the narrative around what public safety is. And so we've invited folks into town halls to be able to have those discussions. And City Council, in following our lead, has decided to have their own town halls to invite other members of the community to also uplift how they would like to see reimagined public safety be implemented. But even in that conversation, we have to name that this motion that has been set forth about removing armed policing responses to nonviolent, non-criminal calls ignores the fact that so many things such as homelessness, which Jane will be able to speak more to in a minute, are deeply criminalized, that it's the way that it's written currently, it's going to be very difficult for us to actually get an implementation that really makes sure that we are not continuing to use police to respond to things that they are ill-equipped to handle. And so we have a lot of work that needs to be done to not only shape the narrative, but to make sure that we're holding our city council members accountable to the things that they claim to want to commit to be doing in this moment. And so I'm really grateful for all of you for joining in this conversation, because it's one that we absolutely must continue to have, because our work is nowhere near done.
Great, thank you so much, Virginia. Actually, to follow up with that with Jane, if we think of the budget as it currently exists and also what Garcetti's proposing, I've heard Hamid describe it as, basically a representation of priorities, the city's priorities and their values. When in K-Town for All, as you work with unhoused people in Koreatown and other places, what does the budget currently say about their values and priorities in regards to unhoused people? And then also, what would an actual caring and abolitionist response look like, especially when it comes to reinvestment?
Hi, this is Jane from K-Town for All. Thank you so much for having us. So to speak on the formation of the People's Budget LA just a bit, I just want to point out that K-Town for All is not an org that has been doing this work for very long. And so we're very grateful for Black Lives Matter LA for bringing us into the coalition. We absolutely did not start out being an abolitionist group or an org that had anything to do with opposing criminalization or law enforcement. We started out just supporting a homeless shelter in our neighborhood of Koreatown, recognizing that there's a dire need out there for basic things like shelter, water, hygiene centers, hand washing stations, showers. None of those needs were being met. And in our neighborhood of Koreatown, we have over 600 people who are experiencing homelessness, and there's really nowhere for people to go to access basic things. And so for the past few days, we've been running around giving out cold water because people don't have access to the most basic thing, which is water. And it took us so long, and we had to partner up with other organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, such as LA Can, Street Watch LA, to form services, not sweeps, to call for these very basic things, basic needs to be met, and they're still not being addressed. And a big part of the reason for that is the budget. So if you look at the mayor's budget, he allocates $3 billion to LAPD and only $400 million to homelessness services. So in his budget summary, he brags about funding 5 safe parking sites or 1 storage location. That's clearly not enough. And even these basic provision of services are not enough, because what people ultimately need is housing. And the mayor has the authority to do things like cancel rent and seize the hotels. LA has 100,000 hotels. 70,000 are going to be empty for the next few years. He could actually house everyone right now if he really wanted to. But the budget clearly shows that his priority is in criminalizing and punishing people for being poor. And so when we saw Black Lives Matter LA tweeting about how they wanted to push back against the mayor's budget, we thought it's absolutely interconnected with our work. And so we joined Black Lives Matter LA, and we got caught up in this national movement. So yeah, I want to show you a visualization of the budget. So I think you might have seen this in the past, okay, Lex is laughing because she knows I'm going to pull out.
Is this the famous bar chart?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when we first convened to work on the People's Budget LA, it was really hard to decipher even like what the LAPD budget was. They make it pretty difficult to figure that out. And we spent like a whole day looking at the budget documents, trying to figure out how much is it actually going to LAPD. And then it was clear that it's $3 billion. And then we looked at the money that's going to other departments. And so I was just really curious about like what that would look like as a chart. And I just graphed it in Excel, and I made this chart, which is now a pillow. So you can see that here. It might be reversed, but you can see how very bottom, $3 billion to LAPD. And then a tiny sliver is going to emergency management. You can't even see it, actually. And if you look at the homelessness budget, $400 million is going to homelessness. But if you dig deeper, it's actually even less than $400 million. So we looked at the LAPD budget, and I can post a link to it, or if it's okay, can I share the screen right now to share the graph?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
You're good to do it.
Okay. So if you look at the homelessness budget, $86 million of it actually goes to policing and sweeps. So $343 million is going to actual services. And those aren't even like actual services. A large portion of that is going to like administration and development costs. So that's why we have such a huge homelessness problem. It's because the city of LA has never prioritized basic human needs, and they've always looked to police and LAPD for everything. So yeah, I'm very grateful that Q-Town for All is part of the People's Budget LA Coalition. And I also want to say that Lex Roman is truly the driving force behind the graphics and so much of the visualization of the People's Budget LA. So I was responsible for one graph, that's it. For anything else, ask Lex Roman.
You made this graph though.
Oh yeah, I made that, the homelessness.
Yeah, don't give me credit for your stuff.
Can I ask one more question to you all and then pass it on to the next facilitator? I would love to ask, you know, bringing Lex into the conversation, as well as Jamie, who was there this morning at the action, to talk a little bit about this 150,000 and in the context of, sorry, 150 million, that Garcetti has said that he was going to divest from or defund the LAPD by that amount, which if we remember from what Virginia was saying is actually less than the amount that he's going to increase it. I wanted to ask about what this represents in terms of pacification or co-optation. You know, we had such a huge uprising, and it's still ongoing in many places. And that uprising itself is part of a longer history of continuous struggle. So I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit about actually the negotiations themselves with City Council and the Police Commission and the mayor, and talk about how that's been going and to what extent you are feeling heard versus feeling, as Hamid was calling it earlier, a mockery of justice. So and then also what can we do ongoing to support the efforts to actually push for a true justice and not that mockery?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to pass it on to perhaps someone from Stop LAPD Spying Coalition to answer that, or Virginia.
Lex, do you want
I was going to say the same thing. I think Jamie or Virginia. We also have Jacob here from People's Budget. But BLMLA is really leading a lot of those negotiations that are going directly with City Council.
Awesome, Virginia. If you feel, and Jacob too, if either of you can talk to that, what are the political dimensions of this in terms of, the city's attempting to divert or pacify energy and revolutionary energy in this case?
So I think I think that I wouldn't categorize what's been happening as a kind of negotiation, right? We want to defund the police, right? So we don't, at no point are we saying, oh, let's talk about a number less than defunding the police. Like that is our goal, right? So anything else is a distraction and it's a diversion. And I think that it's very important to name that $150 million was a number that Garcetti came up with. At no point was that a number that anyone in BLM or a part of people's budget said was acceptable. And so that was a unilateral decision that was made without any input or approval. And I think that that's really important to underscore. I also think that it's also important to talk about co-opting, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Akil, in the way that Garcetti tried to steal the narrative as he, I think someone might be unmuted, but as he introduced the Community Safety Partnership with the words, actually they're Akila Sharil's words, if we want to make sure that we're giving proper attribution, but reimagining public safety. But he used the term that BLM and People's Budget presented before City Council went and made our budget presentation. And so in using something that is old hat, community policing is not defunding, and that's important to name. Community policing is also not imaginative. This is a strategy that has existed for a very long time. It is actually, its current iteration is kind of a vestige of, or has its origins in the crime bill, I should say. And I think most of us are familiar with how disastrous the 1994 crime bill has been for Black and Brown communities. And so it's a strategy that has proven to be costly but ineffective, and it amounts to little more than a publicity stunt, right? And so when we talk about defunding, the other part of our narrative often gets lost, which is we're not just talking about defunding the police, we're talking about funding communities, and we're talking about community, not cops. There are things that can be handled far better by members of the community, as Akila Sherrills pointed out. Akila is from Watts. He was instrumental in the truce between the Crips and the Bloods. He's also a prolific community organizer, and he has been working in the city of Newark to transform the city, really, through adopting an alternative approach to policing that is community-based, where folks who are often seen as, the so-called bad actors, those who are causing harm in the community, are now community leaders. And because of the buy-in that they have with the community, are able to reduce crime. They were able to reduce their homicide rate by 60%, which is unheard of, right? So there are strategies that we know work, like violence interruption programs. When we talk about the CSP, police playing basketball with our children, not only is that the opposite of anything that we would want, I think we also, in connecting this conversation to this idea of surveillance, need to talk about the ways in which we're trying to remove police from our communities because of the ways in which their ever watchful eye has been harmful to our communities. And this is just another way for the LAPD to embed themselves in Black and Brown communities when we're trying to remove that presence. And so I think it's really important to make sure that this defund narrative doesn't become co-opted by these conversations that are essentially reforms that we already know don't work. It's really important to continue to steer this conversation towards defunding and abolition, and really thinking about how we can innovate on creating systems that actually address the root causes of crime, which we know are things like systemic racism and lack of resources. Because when we look at our most resourced neighborhoods, which are often predominantly white, they have very low crime rates. And so it's clearly not, but they also don't have a lot of police, right? And so it's clearly not police that keep us safe. And so I just want to kind of also reframe some of the narrative around those ideas as well.
And just a really quick clarifying question, sorry. Can you elaborate a little bit on, so part of one of the things that we do at Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is also, and in collaboration with BLM and lots of other groups, is really try to fight against this narrative of violent extremism that especially has been used to target youth. And oftentimes these programs present initially as violence interruption through the offering of what they call off-ramps on the path to radicalization, which is, a really Islamophobic framework, but, it ultimately impacts, lots of communities, not just immigrant Muslim communities, but, very gravely Black and Native communities as well. And one thing I wanted to ask is, how do you guard against sort of the introduction of these alternatives to policing being actually a way to surveil and police through the use of social services and violence interruption? How do you make sure that doesn't become basically a more hidden arm of policing?
Well, I think that's why it's so important to make sure that we're decoupling community-led solutions from police. These solutions need to be community-based and community-led. They absolutely cannot be state-based solutions. And so by making sure that we are defunding the police and not investing, or I don't even want to say investing, but I mean continuing to steal resources from our communities and place them into programs like the CSP, then we can actually make sure that the programs that are created are in service of the communities that have been most impacted by systemic violence and police violence, instead of making sure that those systems are being used to continue to police and criminalize Black and brown youth in particular.
Thank you. That's perfect. Yeah, that helped clear it up for me. Alexis, Sophie, anyone else want to take it from here? Sorry about taking so long.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in Jackie into the conversation. Jackie, thank you for making the time to and be available for this conversation. I mean, you have a very interesting vantage point to the budget, and been organizing on the front lines for many years. So would you like to share as to what was your experience sort of, just watching all of this games going on?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Cornejo, they, she, and I currently am, in my official capacity outside of all of this is to be a city employee. But I'm an urban planner, organizer, researcher by trade. Before I, became a city employee, much of the work that I've been focused on is really understanding where our money is going. What do we want it to go towards? And ultimately, how do we ensure that our money, our resources, right, go towards the care and need that residents need here in LA. Prior to, this exciting moment that we're in, unfortunately caused by a crisis, but prior to this, my orientation was really looking at land and capital, right? Who controls the land? Who is making decisions on our behalf on what happens in our neighborhoods? But also how are corporations extracting resources and making our communities poor and sick? I think that what has been really interesting from this process and seeing those of you who've been really involved in the sort of the making of the sausage, right, of really leading to a place where there are real demands around what the city budget is supposed to look like. I've been really thinking a lot about what does it mean to win, right? The pennies that are going towards care as the city is defining it is very different from what many people are experiencing and even shouting from the mountaintops, right? Um, and and so, you know, I think right now, I think what's been so important, and I think given me a lot of food for thought as we're undergoing this process at Stop LAPD Spying, on really understanding the city budget, because the reality is that that information has been really kept from all of us. It's been there, but it's really been kept from us, right? And it's been frankly impossible to really piece together all the different documents that encompass where our money goes, right? And so really thinking about where we want to be, where we are right now, right? And what a win looks like, are sort of all these different concepts that we're trying to make sense of in our heads, right? And I think that the way the narrative has been played out, right, is that it's just about $150 million, right? And that the entire city budget right now is really focused on what to do with that little piece of money, right? And that's what's really holding up the whole process of what the city budget is supposed to look like. A lot of people's lives are hanging in the balance when we're talking about rent, when we're talking about basic necessities that people need, to, in a more trivial sense of what applies to me, is like whether I'll have a full-time job or not, right? And so many things that hang in the balance, right? And so I think that what is really important in this moment is to really think about what are we going to make of this next year as the city continues to figure out how to respond to our demands. Because right now, it seems murky to me. And that's just an honest response to what it looks like, right? I feel like, and perhaps some of those conversations are happening in the negotiations, or however the city is describing it, right? Or even this process in which council members are asking residents to talk about policing, right? I'm in CD10. CD10 had an event. I didn't attend it because I didn't really want to hear about the CSP. But we're in this moment where the city is trying to redefine what abolition looks like, right? What care looks like. And so I think it's important for us to continue to educate ourselves as we're in this process, right? On where the money is going, which departments are really being impacted through this defunding that the city is engaging in. And then if we don't defund in the next year, what is our road to get there, right? Because this is the first time I have seen where there's a real discussion around what is supposed to happen with the city budget. And, you know, I've lived here all my life. And this is the first time that we're really seeing this happen. And it's really up to all of us to really continue to push on those demands from all angles, right? This was the first time that city employees even issued a letter responding to the city budget. There's a number of folks that were behind that effort. And you know, close to 400 employees signed it, which is a small fraction of who works in the city, but it's the first time outside of the scope of our contracts, outside the scope of our pensions, that people really felt like there was a need for us as city employees to respond to the ways in which the city harms residents in the communities that we live in. And so I guess that's what I'll say for now. But you know, and being involved in other campaigns, I think that how we define the win also is really a snapshot of the social, political, and organizing reality that we're in. Right? If we didn't win it all right now, it's not a failure. I would say it's a snapshot of where we are, and it gives us a roadmap of where we need to go. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jackie. So Lex, you know, you're a storyteller, communications, and you know, just and how do we bring this conversation to the larger community? I mean, I'm really interested from your vantage point as a storyteller that how does that story get crafted? So when you're watching a whole lot of things moving, like, you know, it's just a hodgepodge of a whole lot of things. It's like Jackie said, making that sausage. So yeah, what, how do you message that?
That's a question for me.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because I was going to say, I think one of the biggest wins, which we don't actually message because it's kind of hard to, is the public awareness, which I think Jackie was just speaking to. The public awareness about the budget has changed so much, not only in LA, but across the country. Like, People's Budget is a nationwide movement. There's People's Budget, Nashville, Oakland, Austin. I saw like a crazy demonstration in Chicago with physical boxes representing the budget. So, I mean, that's a thing that I haven't seen before. You know, and Jane and I in the past had definitely made bar charts of the city budget. Like, at least last year we did, and then nothing happened with those. So that's a big win. Having a lot, you know, having thousands of people in the street chanting defund the police, I think that's a pretty significant thing. It's hard to measure, I guess. But People's Budget, and certainly in LA, has been really instrumental in that. And to your point, social media has been really powerful in spreading education and awareness and hashtags and those sort of like sound bites that people should be echoing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, the pandemic has made social media sort of uniquely powerful, I guess, even more so than it was before. And to Jane's point, we've used a lot of graphics to simplify some of these things that are really complicated. And to Jackie's point, it's incredibly hard to unpack the budget. Even though they have an open budget tool on the city website, but it's somewhat misleading. About, like, for example, LAPD is getting $3.15 billion, or was allocated to do that. I don't know what that is, minus $150 million, plus back the CSP. But you don't see that. If you go to the city's budget tool, it'll tell you the LAPD gets 1.8, right, because they're not counting the pensions, they're not counting electricity. That's going into other departments. Right. So that's where it gets really confusing, and that's where the visuals and the social strategy and the breaking down, and K-Town does a great job of that too, breaking stuff down for folks, walking them through it, helping people, you know, be able to explain it to their friends and family so that they can all show up to actions and all call city council and call in and give public comment in an informed way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lex. Which then, just bringing me to Sophie and Alexis and Jamie, of course, we've been doing this deep dive, and we've been dealing with our own, trying to unpack these darn complexities around the documentation, even trying to understand what a base budget is, right? I mean, something as basic as that. So yeah, and then of course our goal is really to exactly what you said, Lex, said, how do we continue to popularize, and what are the various tools that we use to mainstream and develop popular education tools in that as well. So yeah, but Jamie, do you want to get us off on that conversation as to how and what kind of deep dive are we engaging in, and we'll move on to Sophie and Alexis?
Yeah, thanks. And this is really a great conversation. I'm glad that we're all coming together and talking about the various ways that we are engaging with understanding the budget. I think the only piece that I wanted to raise is, as we think about the amount of funding that LAPD gets, is that we can't just stop with the general funds. We have to realize they have grants from the National Institute of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Urban Area Security Initiative. They have unrestricted funds that they get access to, reserved funds, special funds, budget stabilization funds. They get private monies through donations. I mean, there was hundreds of $1,000s today that was just passing through the police commission. So I think that our understanding of where they're, there was another document we were going through, a public records request with HACLA and the public housing, right? And LAPD had recently renovated closed circuit television cameras, and HACLA bought more, and they paid for them. LAPD didn't pay for them. So the amount of money they're getting is actually phenomenal. And the fact that they can't produce anything to us that basically says what a base budget is, how a budget before that year gets kind of rolled over to the next year, not the funds necessarily that weren't spent, but the allocation of those funds. And then they request more money the following year to go on top of that. And I'll let Sophie and Alexis kind of speak about that. We have to realize that they have their hands everywhere. And I think that even shows us where the city's kind of priorities are, that it's not only do they want to give a massive amounts, but they want to create opportunities for them to actually drain funding from other departments and actually hide that in a way where we're not even aware of it unless we are searching through documents and realizing that, public housing, which is completely underfunded, completely, in these kind of torn conditions, are actually paying for the technology that LAPD is putting up. And then LAPD comes in, and that what was so interesting about that document is that they come in and have full reign over the CCTV. So they have full access to the automatic license plate reader technology that comes through the CCTV, or that's attached to the CCTV. And those departments don't have access to that. In fact, they can only access up to a certain amount if they're approved from LAPD. So here they are paying for something and they don't even get control of it or even get to decide what happens to it. So I think for me, in this deep dive that we're doing in trying to understand it, it's going to be even more imperative that we start to understand where else they're getting funding from, because they're hiding that. And I think that will even, at the same time, draw more people in to realize that this is a huge corporation that, when we see with the budget itself, just from the general fund, is paying for salaries, is paying for pensions. And so they're arming themselves through other ways, other means. And it's going to be so important for us to completely unpack that, because at that same time, it just mirrors the military, where it becomes something that is just this monster that has been fed and continues to need to be fed. And at a certain point, people themselves, like the city themselves, probably don't even understand all the different types of money they're receiving. And so I think this kind of work and this kind of community education, self-education, knowledge sharing, knowledge building with each other is vital for where we're going. And as Jackie said, like, we are in a certain point right now, but we are realizing the work that we need to do.
Thank you, Jamie. So, Alexis, Sophie, please talk about the deep dive that's been going on, and what are some of what are we unearthing?
For sure. So Sophie and I are part of a collective called Free Radicals. So we're an activist collective that works at the intersection of science and social justice. And we've been working with Stop LAPD Spying for a couple of years on dismantling different predictive policing programs. But we thought that this whole national movement around the budget was a really great opportunity to look at the surveillance budget overall. So like Jane mentioned, looking through the LAPD budget is definitely extremely challenging. We're kind of like cross-referencing dozens of different documents, and it's obvious that they make it kind of like by choice make it difficult to comprehend, because they don't want us to know what is. It's not even $3 billion, right? That's $3 billion that the city budget is going into LAPD, but that doesn't count the money coming from the mayor's office. If the library spends $1 million on LAPD for security, that goes into the library budget, not the LAPD budget. So to really go through all the budgets and really understand that LAPD is getting hundreds of millions of dollars on top of that $3 billion that comes directly from the city's general fund. But in trying to kind of understand the scope of everything, we decided to really focus on their technology, because we know that there's a growing public consciousness around policing and its legacy of white supremacy and the desire to, reduce the size of the police force. But one strategy that LAPD is using is trying to use more and more technology, more and more data-driven strategies, and claiming that it makes them more efficient. So yeah, you can reduce our patrol size, but we're going to also, use Palantir or use, social media analytics and all these other tools that actually make it so that we are interacting with the police more often in more places, right? So, when you driving your car and you pass an automatic license plate reader, like that is an interaction with the police, even though those things are made invisible. So in going through the budget, first we're trying to really expose LAPD. What are these other technologies and other programs that they're using that maybe they're not necessarily talking about, right? Really trying to kind of start putting a face and a name to this whole web of contracts and vendors. Who are the other Palantirs that they're, collaborating with? How can we kind of unravel this ecosystem? And also, how can we start to make demands of them to defund these technologies, right? Because these technologies really create the conditions that facilitate police violence, which, Stop LAPD Spying has talked about before the bullet hits the body. So, we need to have also a focus on these technological pieces that they're increasingly investing in every year, in order to combat, the widespread nature and omnipresence of LAPD everywhere.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I know a lot of the folks who are on this call are familiar with what happened in the budgeting process and with that $150 million cut. But for folks who don't know, originally the proposed cut was more than 150 million. It was around 250 million. And there was a special meeting of the budget committee, and they actually, one of the things that was slated to be cut was the technology support for LAPD. And the council members and the folks from LAPD were adamant that they keep technology support in the budget increases. And they justified it by saying that this technology support program, that this record management system, which they're spending $10 million on, is going to make it possible for them to make up for the loss of the force, right? For that's coming from the budget cuts. And of course, that's the opposite of the whole point of calling for the defunding of the police. We don't want them to be more efficient and more and have more efficacy as an organization, as this corporation that is enacting violence in the communities, but now just through these technological means as opposed to just officers on the ground. And so that's one of the big things that we want to push against is you can't just turn your policing from people into technologies and say that you're doing what the people want, because you're still basically doing the exact same things in our communities. And right now, Alexis and Hamid and I are going through we've started with the last 3 or 4 years, but hopefully going through the last 10 years of both the LAPD's proposed budgets for the each year, and then also matching them up with the mayor's blue book. So for folks who have done a bit of budget digging themselves, I'm sure these are familiar terms, but we have already seen some things like the proposed budgets for the LAPD and then we'll see the proposed budget and then the actual amount that was spent, and there's just $3 million of extra money that was spent in just technology support alone that's not accounted for. There are all of these numbers that just don't make sense at all, even amongst the ways that the budget itself is already confusing. So it's been quite an experience going through. If anyone is interested in supporting that work, it would be awesome to have more hands on deck looking through these budgets and helping us build out. We have a spreadsheet right now, so if anyone's really into spreadsheets, this is the group for you. But as Alexis is talking about, and as everyone's been talking about, I mean, ultimately the goal is also to translate this, as Lex, as Jane were talking about, into something that is digestible, into something that makes this budget a little bit more legible to folks. Because the first part of that process is making it legible to us. And that's what we're still working on right now. We'll talk a little bit about some zine and graphic things in a little bit too.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
just to add one little tidbit, like one example of the, funky math they do. So they have a line item in the Blue Book that's like $1.4 million from civil asset forfeiture. So this is literally money that they have stolen from communities, and that isn't counted as income. It's just counted as dash to upgrade all their laptops and things. So that's an example of another line item that doesn't even get included in the $3 billion.
Absolutely. So we're gonna pause there for a second and see if anybody has any comments or questions. Please, if you wanna, and I know Gina has a comment about, are we gonna give thoughts about the reimagined county ballot, Measure J? We'll see how it rolls, Gina. Definitely that's a very critical piece that is moving in LA County. But what we have heard up until now, if folks have any comments or questions, please just either raise your hand or, yeah. Okay, so let me just see. Armando, you have go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Just did. Hi, everyone. So thank you to Lexi and Jen for going over the budget, because I did an action today where I emailed the mayor and city council and got a response from the mayor's help desk where he did cite that 1.8 billion number, and I was wondering how that could be so off of what I understand it to be that 3 billion, which was just crazy. So thank you for this. Learned a lot, and just really enjoying seeing everybody interact with public affairs and really just dive into all the work that we have to do. Yeah, just thank you so much for putting this together.
Of course, absolutely. Thank you for joining. Any other comments or thoughts? So yes, so $1.8 billion is the direct cost, and the $3 billion includes the pension fund and other things as well. Absolutely. Anybody else has any comments or any thoughts about what we have heard? Let me just quickly go through this. I don't see anybody asking questions. So with that in mind, just going back to maybe Virginia, if you could talk a little bit more that, so where are we at now with that people's budget? What is the current status of, just as to where that conversation is?
So we're definitely continuing to have this conversation, and we're continuing to push for the defunding of the police. I think it's an interesting moment because we saw, and this was something that I've personally felt, and I'm going to kind of digress for a moment because it's very deeply connected, but there's kind of an unease that I think I felt and a lot of other Black folks in this moment where everyone was responding to racism for the first time, it seemed, right? And people were so galvanized, people were showing up in the streets in droves, and it was beautiful, but it also felt, I think for many of us, there was kind of this uneasy feeling that it wasn't necessarily going to be sustainable, right? And so I think it's interesting where we're at a point where a lot of people are continuing to have this conversation, but the conversation is not as loud as it was initially, right? And so now we're also seeing, which should not be surprising, the police and the sheriffs and other pro-LAPD groups rising up and counter-organizing against our calls to defund the police. And so there's this deeply, sorry, an echo, but there's this deeply kind of I really want to, it's hard to frame this any other way, but a lot of the conversation about whether or not to defund police is really deeply rooted in white supremacy. And it's very difficult, I think, to fight that battle without a really broad coalition of support, you know? And so the same folks who are showing up and saying, you know, defund the police back in June have to continue to be making these calls and have to continue to be showing up at police commission meetings, even though we know, and this was part of the action this morning, that they don't actually want to allow for our voices to be heard, you know, and continuing to make sure that this conversation is amplified, because I think we're going to continue to fight this battle no matter what. But if you want to be able to actually create the sustainable conditions under which we can really create a thriving city for all of us, right? Because even though the expense that we are undertaking every single year when we give such a really devastating portion of our money to policing, even though that disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities, that affects all of our communities. And those are resources that are being taken away from our children, from our schools, from teachers, from green spaces. Like, if we can all think about the thriving Los Angeles that we would like to see and think about our actual material reality, then it stands to reason that this is all of our fight. And so I would kind of encourage people to continue fighting that along with us, because I think our work hasn't really changed, but I think some of this, the conversation around our work hasn't really been as loud as it was previously, if I'm being honest.
I think the question really for some of us who've been sort of fiercely abolitionists for forever, it is challenging to sometimes to even have this conversation as well. That does that water it down? Does that take away? Have we conceded ground where you know, from claim just fighting for abolition, and then we moved into the defunding piece? Did that take away the power of that movement building towards the abolition of policing? So these are all real questions, and at least on a personal level for myself, you know, these become really crucial. That in a sense, that does the defunding conversation kind of take away the oomph, take away the breadth of movement building around the abolition of policing. So that's why these conversations become really critical. Mariela, I know you had a message, you wanted to make a comment. Let me just go ahead and try to unmute yourself. Yes.
Greetings, hey everybody. Calling in from home. My name is Mariela. I'm really grateful for this space and this conversation. And as I'm listening, I've been mostly thinking about how important it is to popularize the research, the education, and the experiences we already know that will popularize a more powerful understanding and action around why defunding the police it's an important call, and I really like that we that we especially have a lot of we've done a lot of work, like you all have mentioned, to map out and to see all the intertwined connections between the police and just police state in general. And I think I just see a lot of graphic work, artwork, and also street theater work that Jamie and I were actually talking about earlier today. I feel like it's really needed in this work, so that all our families who are having to interface with these conversations, whether they want to or not, we're being asked to. So I think we need more materials, and I hear we're doing that. So I just want to invite us and myself to imagine how does that look like in the streets? How do we create our own wall art, billboards, things that will help folks understand and think and popularize why this is like a very critical strategy to reclaim the resources, share the story of historically of policing and the state in general. And I love that folks are thinking about, yeah, it has to be a broad coalition movement. A lot of folks to say why this has to happen. So just some thoughts. Thanks, y'all.
So without seeing that everybody shows up at your place, Mariela, I mean, there's a theatro convening going on at 2 o'clock on Sunday, where just around there. Let me hang on a second. Let me just go ahead and unmute yourself, Mariela.
Thank you. Yeah, and if it's a larger gathering, we were just calling this gathering earlier today. If it's a larger gathering, we could also find the right location for us to be just free to.
Do the LA Cans rooftop too. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we'll be surveilled the whole time, but
Awesome.
But it's, yeah, we could do some really dope stuff. I actually, on that point, like banner art, continued art that faces up as we're being watched. It's time for art, lots of art, y'all.
Yes. I just want to say that Mariela is also the founder of Teatro East of the River Collective. So there's a lot of coalition, just even today when we were at the mayor's house about 5 years ago, late December, just before Christmas, we had an action outside around the drones, and we turned that into Christmas caroling. And the LAPD showed up in riot gear. So, and then they had to move away because we said, hey, we're doing Christmas caroling. So do you also come in riot gear with Christmas carols out here? So, of course, and then we would go, and it was raining hard, and it was one of those moments that were kind of drenched, and we get to all his neighbors, and had those neighbors come out, and they looked at us like, who are you folks? And we're doing this whole song, like flying through the sky, a brand new dragonfly, which was the name of the drone, and all of that. And then we basically, and they didn't know that LAPD was getting drones at the time. So theater definitely in teatro has a very, very critical place. So thank you, Mariela, for sharing that. And Andrew, do you want, if Andrew says to have a brief contribution? Andrew, go ahead. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for all the wonderful work that you've been doing. I worked as a community organizer about 15 years ago with Acorn, and I'm doing other things with my life right now. But one thing that I think is really important that the coalition does is a work of translation, because the things that make us win that we're strong in are not really necessarily expertise. And when it comes to policy making and budgeting, it's very much about an expert-driven world in which people have to spend a lot of time, go through a lot of didactic documents, and there's only a few people who are able to really spend all of that time. And so I feel like it's not only just education, but I think it's also going beyond education. So I don't think everyone needs to know the ins and outs of budgets, because I think that budgets are a language that are used to exclude. It's elitist. It's meant to make sure that there are very private conversations with small groups of people making decisions for the rest of us. So one thing that I think that the coalition does really effectively is use really direct and easy to understand terminology to reframe the conversation on grounds that we can win, on things that we can support. Like everyone knows what abolition is, or someone can understand abolition very quickly. Someone can understand what surveillance bureaucracy is and know why surveillance bureaucracy is bad. And so for me, I think a big part of the process, and why someone like me who's currently working in higher education is really attracted to the coalition, is that it's about breaking it down and taking the power away from these people who've been able to sort of keep their conversation to a small group of people and make it very private and very expert driven. And I think that was something a problem that I saw for a long time in some of the environmental movement that I was engaging in that they've been very lawyer focused for maybe about the last 40 years. And they almost have always gotten their wins through EPA lawsuits, or at least public hearings, in which it was very much about hiring consultants and doing policy work and trying to intervene in that way. And so I think, for me, what a win looks like is getting these conversations out of just the really narrow confines of where a few people can really make a serious contribution, and widen them to where everyone can be part of the conversation. because when we do that, then we can really win.
Great, thank you.
Everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that at least over the last 10 years, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has been able to move as well, that how did we bring the conversation of surveillance to the ground level? And to your point, Andrew, historically speaking, for many years, this was very much a domain, very exclusive domain of these highly paid nonprofit law firms like the ACLU and EFF and others, which were very much within a very white privilege space as well, and continues to do that. So how do we bring that? So where the response to surveillance was always filing a lawsuit about violation of First Amendment or Second Amendment or this amendment, or it was like seeking out friendly legislators to move and create more bureaucracy under the guise of transparency. So that's why the coalition completely rejects any form of oversight, transparency legislation or ordinances that the ACLU looks for, and we have publicly opposed them and come after them as well. So that's why it's crucial that that our stories are through the truths and the histories of our communities. That's why we are guided by our bases. We're guided by the impact on our communities. So talking about storytelling, so maybe we can just let me just see if there's any more comments. There's one that when looking at total costs of policing, even specific to LA, there are also allied agencies to LAPD such as port and school police. Do we also have the capacity to look at those? This does not address the other elements of the city's regulatory footprint, but maybe that later. So absolutely, I mean, I think this is a pretty broad landscape, and I think Jamie kind of just lifted that that even when someone else is paying for something, it's the LAPD that has an exclusive claim to what comes out of it. So absolutely, it's about our policing, and that's where the deep dive becomes necessary as well. So maybe moving into that, let's talk about how because our comrades, our partners from folks who have been also doing that as well, it'll be good to collectively have this conversation about like how we are looking to popularize this thing. I know they've been, so Sophie, if you want to just maybe, and Akhil, and walk us through like some of the conversations we've had around maybe a series of zines. And what that whole process could potentially look like, where we are at right now, and how do we build, and what sort of like a very baseline survey could look like in our communities, like just when we are doing Wellness Wednesdays or Sunday Strong at LA Can, that becomes really crucial because that's where our communities, like getting that feedback becomes important. So take it away.
Yeah, sure. I can start talking a little bit about that. I think that it's been brought up a couple of times already, the importance of creating visualizations, popular education, these kinds of political ed tools that break down something that's super complex that, as I mentioned earlier, we're still trying to understand into both like a message and action that folks can take, and also just to break down the problems. I mean, that's a little bit more digestible. So we've been talking a little bit about creating two pieces. So one is kind of like a mini zine, or possibly could be also a graphic, depending on how folks feel. We'd love to get feedback on both of these pieces from you all who are on the call today. And then another that's a zine that may be a little bit more beefy and have a little bit more content. So the two ideas, and Akhil, also you can jump in at any time, any of the other folks who were part of that conversation, feel free to add anything. But let me see if I can screen share. We have a little bit of a description of the zines written out. Let's see. All right, that should be it. So can folks see the document? All right, so this first description of the zine, this is a mini zine around the topic for today that we've been talking about, what is progress or what is victory? And this actually came out of an idea that Akhil had brought up at one of our meetings. Do you want to talk a little bit about it? And then I can go through like the different breakdown of the pages that we've talked about so far.
Sure. When I first learned about how the 150 million that Garcetti proposed, after he originally proposed 250 million, and how it's less than the proposed increase it really reminded me a little bit of this Malcolm X quote. And so the quote is listed here, but I'll read it out loud too. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, if you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. So if you think of the police budget as a, like the knife in the back as a metaphor for the police budget, what's actually happening is that he's claiming he's pulling it out 3 inches, which is not 6 inches, which would not even be progress in the sense of Malcolm X's quote. But what he's actually doing it is pushing it further in, just less deeply more in than he originally said. And he's claiming that that's some great act of benevolence or generosity, or that he's responsive and listening to the community's needs. And I think that a lot of people, including, at the beginning, family members and relatives who texted me when they saw the news of that, they may not necessarily understand the context of how even the $3 billion, the fact that there's a proposed increase, that this is coming out of the CSP Bureau. So I think that this mini zine or graphic is really about trying to make sure that we're all vigilant and we still have a fire in us, pushing for, nothing, as Victoria would say, nothing less than full defunding. No amount is satisfactory. In fact, anything less than that is basically, it to me comes across as the LAPD buying people's just forgiveness for all their harm. You know what I mean? So, and it's definitely not healing the wound because they're continuing to inflict it. So I think that metaphor has turned into sort of a visual graphic to express this. So that's the mini zine, and you can elaborate, Sophie, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll just leave this up as I scroll down. I think you should be able to see if folks want to read through kind of our outline for it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I think I said Victoria when I meant Virginia. I'm really sorry.
It's okay. It happens.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
So we can also quickly, I can just go through the current outline for it. We're thinking of doing just like an 8-page, 1-sheet little zine with really simple illustrations or graphics for each of them. We had talked about using this second page as the first page, but from our conversation, using this as the first image felt kind of, you don't necessarily want to have an extremely violent image as the first image for the zine. So we thought about changing it to progress is healing the wound, a little bit more uplifting. And then the second page is to illustrate start the illustration of the quote, which is that there's a silhouette of a figure, which is representing the LAPD, which is holding the knife into a silhouette that's labeled as the people, as represented in the original quote. And then to show an x-ray of the knife labeled with different parts of the LAPD. So naming things like CSPs, naming specific equipment like body cameras that people are funding that are actually still harmful. And then the next page is showing how the city council and how the mayor's office are also complicit. So showing them propping up, supporting the LAPD figure. And then the silhouette of the people really pushing back, representing all of the protests, all of the calls for defunding, saying to pull the knife out to heal the wound. And then Garcetti and City Council saying that they're listening, of course, because that's all they do. Eileen Decker on the police commission saying we're listening. And then the next one is the response from all of them after they've listened, which is Garcetti. We probably will change how this is written, but the gist is, well, we were going to push the knife in 3 more inches, but instead we've heard what you're saying, in response, and it's great victory for the people, we'll just push it in 1.5 more inches. And then not entirely sure if we want this to be the last page or if we want something additional, but then LAPD taking that, pushing the knife in, and then with the caption of, is this a victory? And then, yeah, so that's kind of the current idea for this mini zine. Welcome any thoughts on this, but then also I think it would be paired with the second scenes, which has a little bit more of an imaginative slash creative slash uplifting element to it, and also gives a little bit more nuance into what we want instead. But yeah, I'll open it for any questions at this point. I think Common can unmute people or you raise your hands.
So
if there's anything in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see while I have the screen share up, I think.
Yeah,
so.
if you don't mind pulling the screen down. Because I can't see the chat in there because of the screen. So
Okay. There we go.
All right. So any thoughts? Because this is going to be a series where where we're going to be expanding on this, and this is the very first one that's going to be sort of like going out. So any suggestions, any thoughts that come immediately for all the artists in the in the mix? Messaging. Okay, Armando, go ahead. Let me unmute you. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hi, not an artist or anything, but I like it from a historical standpoint because I think a lot of people tend to forget that activists like Malcolm X, they came to Los Angeles and interacted and motivated people. So I think leaning into the history of that will be really effective and can probably be done through video so that it can be on Instagram or something where people will share it for the memory or for the iconicism of Malcolm X, but will then be educated on the actual what's happening currently in Los Angeles. So I think that's really effective.
Nice, thank you, Armando. One comment here is also from Steve that and this is one of our guiding sort of values that we use, not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So they're saying that the not a moment in time concept would be also nice. Fix one thing and they will find another way to oppress. So maybe adding that to the mix as well. Any other thoughts on this one? Because we invite people to join this process too. And this is, so this actually, our webinars are also like working meetings as well, because every document that goes out is brought to the community and the community has to participate. If they don't, we don't let them leave. So yeah. Jane, did you have a comment?
Yeah, the asterisk means I have a comment, I guess. Yeah, I offered to help with anything for the zine. I think that's a brilliant idea. Absolutely love it. I've seen Stop LAPD Spying zines in the past, and they're very cute. So I love the cute aesthetics. I think that's something that K-Town for All also excels at, is like the cuteness of it, to make this more of like an accessible concept for people, really emphasizing the concepts of love and compassion. So if you need artists to make cute illustrations, please let me know. We have the hookup for that. And yeah, I'm just excited about any new art to media that's being created out of this movement. I can't wait to share it. We do weekly outreach in K-Town in which we share zines. So we would love to also share this as part of our weekly community outreach.
I think that,
this is one of the ones that, oh, I'm sorry, Akil. I was just going to.
Mariela also wanted to get in as well. Mariela was raising their hand.
Got it. I'm just going to bring it back. So this was just maybe one of the zines that, yeah, which we put on the War on Youth. So yeah. Okay.
And that's with, want to shout out Baby Anarchists, who made the art for those zines.
Right. Go ahead, Mariela, unmute yourself.
Cool. Sorry. We have my family with me. I didn't get to. I read a lot of what was written, and the pieces I saw I thought were very powerful. Bye, everybody. um, the knife. I really like the idea that it's saying, what it's made up of, and I want to see it actually. That I want to see it, and I think in the creation of it, other ideas might come through, but I think it's a really powerful concept to start with or to go with. But maybe not that way. That way. Thank you. Yay. While I was here, LAPD helicopter had come over, and Yoali asked me to close my ears. So I'm just thinking about what the images and videos look like for children and youth who are a lot of them are online right now and are about these questions too. And so the person who said the cutesy stuff, or just, I'm thinking about, or in other words, like how can children and other folks see a graphic that also might not be too scary for them when you do see a knife, which is things that kids do see and is real. I just always think about how to maybe their imagination and how we need to make space for youth and children to be informing the defund the police conversation and where resources are needed.
Thank you, Maria.
Actually, Marielle, that's a great note to move on to the second scene. I know that it's at 7:30, so I don't know how much time we want to spend on this, but if I can just go over the idea for that really quickly, that's the one that contains a little bit more of the imaginative space for folks to also.
Sure. While you do that, let me just go to Akhil because he had a comment too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh yeah, I actually would love to hear one more time from Mariela about something that kind of bridges the divide between the other zine too. And one quick thing about, I think that's a really great point that, we need to think about how the images can also be very graphic for people, especially people who've experienced the trauma of police violence. So that was a good thing. And then the other thing that I was going to say is that hopefully if this is an effective zine, even though it's very directly about this particular moment and what Garcetti, is trying to do, it's such a common trope that people, oppressors, like slightly reducing the level of their oppression and claiming that as benevolence, or even stopping one thing and then saying, okay, just forget about it and move on. I mean, we saw that with Operation Laser, where we're continuing to push for a true accounting and reckoning with the harm that was perpetrated, and we're not going to move on, So I think that hopefully the zine will have continued relevant. I mean, I shouldn't say hopefully, because hopefully this all will be abolished and there'll be justice. But short of that, hopefully it's relevant for other cases. And then I wanted to ask Mariela one thing, because I got to unfortunately leave a little bit early, and I really want to hear her wise words on this before this relates to the other zine. So Mariela once really gave me some sage advice about a situation I was in with an ex who had police trauma and was home alone with potentially like beginnings of a fire, and was scared to call 911. And Mariela had called that, and I think that this is a term that Mariela had also used in our Data Bodies project, but you can elaborate, this idea of genocidal setups, when people are forced through dependency to rely on systems that are harmful for them. And we can think of this in the context of the stalker state, the LAPD, the Stop LAPD spying, understanding that all of these systems are tied together through information sharing, things that are seemingly benevolent, social services, if they're an arm of this colonial state that's occupying land, that is continuing to invade and steal, and it's inherently, there's an element of harm, and there's this notion that we approach in the zine of poisoned food, you know, so the communities are facing a choice between starvation or poisoned food. And Mariela, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on this, how it relates to the work of our data bodies, and also what options are there to actually, you know, for the community to have its needs met when even social services are weaponized and used for policing, even medicine, even education. So yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Thank you for the question and your thoughts on it too. How well can you hear me? Can you hear me? If a thumbs up helps. Do I have to hear me, Akil, or other folks just to show me?
It's sort of breaking up, but it's getting better.
Oh, you're on mute. I forget. Oh. Yeah, I have to be outside right now. I don't want to take too much space and time. But you mentioned genocidal. That, yeah, I think that's what it is when you are cornered in different ways. And the first example that comes up for me is the court system and the prison system, and folks, after being stolen from their communities, they're being told, they're given an offer, a deal, and this is all language of enslavement, and it's always offers and deals that make you have to be incarcerated, because you're forced in a violent way into options that are gonna hurt either way. So let's sit down right here, mommy. Yeah, so the only thought on it right now for this work is just how do we Yuali wants to do some other activity right now, so I'm gonna transition soon. I'm just thinking about how we right now practice and imagine just communities of people not having to rely on either of the options that any state agency is set up or forcing you to engage with. What if we do have another option or multiple, an abundance of options? And that comes in relationships with each other and creating all the other care systems. And so, yeah, I think a lot of imagery around that is just as important, and could be on the flip side on the other side of any zine or any, like, I think it just has to be presented to what does the, all right, sending love from all of us.
Thanks, Mariela.
That's a great time. So Sophie, do you want to take it because that's a perfect transition to what that zine is about, right?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely move us into the second zine, which, as you're saying, is a perfect transition. Thank you, Mariela, for that. So I'm going to share my screen again. So this second zine, this is the working title, is Don't Get Distracted on the Road to Abolition. But the goal for this zine is really to talk about that concept, right, of how we as a community have certain things that we want, right? We want things like education. We want things like safe communities. We want things like public health services and public health taken care of for our communities. But right now, the options that we're given are being limited by what the state is giving us. And so we were thinking for the second zine of basically portraying a series of the community's needs, and then showing with visual metaphors how each of the ways that those needs are being met by the state are things like being offered the choice of no food or poisoned food, or that at one hand is offering a resource while the other is holding a gun, or this kind of Trojan horse metaphor. And then the different topics that we'd be covering each of these, we would show the need, how the state is proposing to fulfill those needs. And also many of these things are things that the city government has currently proposed as an alternative for where the funding can go that's taken away, that's being disinvested from the LAPD. They're proposing to reinvest it into different city services, which we know also are part of the surveillance state and also have different flaws. And then the idea is to create, on the opposite side of that page, a space where we ask the folks who are reading the zines to envision and imagine how they actually would want to see those needs met. So for example, with education or with, let's say, services for all, we would want to see like mental health services for folks in our communities, right? And for the city, they're saying, oh, well, we'll fund like our own mental health services, but of course in those spaces data is still collected. The way that folks treat folks who are going in isn't necessarily adding to their quality of life. They're not life affirming, they're not caring services. And so what are the ways that we can, as a community member, imagine how you would actually want those services? And we're thinking of, one of the ideas that we talked about is using this also as kind of a form of like a qualitative survey in some ways. And then if there's a way that we can have folks fill out this scene with these pages that are supposed to be interactive, you can draw your own vision of what that looks like, then we can also like collect some of those answers and do kind of like a visualization of what the ways that people want to see this. So this is also kind of building off the People's Budget work a little bit, right? Because a lot of that work was around where do you want to see, what do you want to see being disinvested from, and where do you want to see it invested? And this would be how do you want to see that reinvested? And yeah, so some of the ideas for the topics, especially relevant right now, if we want safe communities, one of the ways that the city is saying that we can have that is through these community safety partnerships, these CSPs. But of course, we know that they're not only directly harmful to the communities that they're part of, but also collect data on our youth in our communities that will allow them to continue to surveil and to harm them. So if the city is proposing that we can have safe communities through CSPs, and we know that's not true, what do you as the reader of the zine, as a member of the community, envision as an alternative for how we can build safe communities? So that's just one example. Other ones are, I know that some folks probably know that the city is putting together a civil and human rights department, which is going to be run by former cop Capri Maddox. They're creating this new panel on reform for the police commission because, of course, the police commission, which is supposed to be the community voice, isn't actually keeping the police accountable. So all of these different kinds of topics, which I think you can see on the screen right now. But that's just the general idea for this, this second scene. If anyone has any thoughts, any feedback on it, any ideas, want to contribute, welcome them now.
So any thoughts? Again, I can't see the chat, Sophie, so you may have to pull that. Sorry for that. I just don't know how that technology works, that you can read the chat at the same time. So yeah, any thoughts, any comments? And let's see, time check at 7:42. I want to circle back to Virginia, Jane, and Lex as well, and Jackie. So to wrap this part of the conversation, but any thoughts, anything? So folks who've been involved with the People's Budget piece, so maybe I can just circle back to Virginia and Jane and Lex. Any thoughts as to the way we are approaching this thing, and how do you see this building?
Please, not everyone all at once.
Go ahead,
No,
Virginia.
I feel like this work is really great. I was, kind of Insta-stalking the baby anarchist Instagram just now because I'm like, what is their work? This is great. But no, I feel like we really need to break down these ideas as simply as possible in ways that are really visually engaging. And I think especially in a moment where like images that are like very shareable and memeable have a lot of value, it's really important that you guys are doing this work that will, you know, carry that message in a way that has a high amount of visual impact. So I'm excited to see what comes next.
Cool.
I
Jane, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing that I've learned. I mean, these are super cool. Zines are amazing. And like Jane said, they do some cool ones at K-Town. One thing that I've learned, which might be of use to you, which you already probably know, but what's been interesting for me on People's Budget is we've sort of traveled around the city to different areas to hear feedback. You know, do these BLMLA has been hosting these people's comment sessions, and it is really very different wherever you are in the city, what people are concerned about, where they want to spend that money. And so that's an interesting thing to try to land on when you're trying to reach a broad audience. Like where their mind is going. Like we did one in South LA that was very different from the one that happened in West LA. So that's just been interesting. Like, how do you message stuff? Who are you targeting? How will they react to certain messaging, and what kind of action would they take off of that?
Jane, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the concept of providing the public with a false choice is really interesting, and something that we see the city try to do time and time again when they present people who are unhoused with these very bad choices between like a homeless shelter where they could get COVID and really substandard living conditions, or living on the streets where they have all their stuff thrown out. And so they keep presenting these inhumane choices, and they are using that to then blame people for continuing to live on the streets. So yeah, that's definitely a very important point to be made, especially as it relates to homelessness, is that there's really no concern given to what people actually want, which is a home. And so they keep going to these just bureaucratic systems in which they will tell people what they want and what they need. And it's really not at all what people actually need. So yeah, we can definitely tie that into the city's mismanagement of the homelessness crisis.
Great. Thank you. Other comments on this, what we have heard? I'm also going to put something that Andrew just shared about a feminist economics book with practical planning activities used extensively globally. So, so here's the link to that. If folks want to just check that out. Yeah, Mariela, go ahead. Let me just unmute you. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. I love the piece and the breakdown of what is being proposed and what the city's response, etc. is, and I think our work is in like what is the abolitionist imagination? Like what are I really just feel like putting out.
Go ahead. You have to unmute again because you muted yourself.
Oh.
Yeah, you're good.
Nelly, actually, I did that. Yeah, just what are people proposing, and if we don't, what if we use these images to call on the gathering for more imagination, abolitionist imagination kind of proposals? Because I think it's great that we're showing all the pieces that we're showing here, and I think there just needs to be more work around imagination and space for it. It's one idea.
Great.
Maybe another session, another meeting could be about that too.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank
And
you.
going off of that, I
Mhm.
think on that note of imagination, maybe we could do like two versions of it. And one is like the collective imagination from the folks on like meetings like this. So we can give some kind of visual for here's what we're imagining. And then as a jumping off point for folks also. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, great. So a lot going on. So in the last few minutes that we have, maybe circling back. So maybe just going to you, Jackie, as to if you can briefly just, so what is the current vibe in the City Hall, particularly, I mean, of course, when in May they had announced massive furloughs and, you know, a whole bunch of things happening. So do you want to share some of that as to where things are?
Sure. I'll start off first with saying, like, I think really appreciate this conversation around collective learning. I think that for those of us who've been part of the nonprofit industrial complex, there's like sort of think tanks that are focused on sort of creating the prescribing the recommendations. And I feel like we're in this moment where it's about all of us learning how to craft the solutions that we've been looking for. I mean, I think in terms of the you know what the feeling is, right, is that, I mean, there's still some sense of uncertainty, right? You know, in terms of even furloughs and what the budget process is going to look like. It seems like every quarter or so, the city's going to, you know, essentially report back on revenue projections, knowing that this pandemic is dramatically impacting where the money comes from. And I think that whether or not the city wants to, there will have to be a reckoning on the police budget because we're running out of money. That's the reality. And so, and people are hurting. So I think that there's that piece of it. You know, the fending off of furloughs depends on people voluntarily signing up for the separation incentive program, and it's dependent on 1,300 people accepting early retirement. And that means that there's less capacity, knowing that, and a lot of folks with deep knowledge of the bureaucracy will no longer be part of the city. But that's just a reality, you know, understanding that there are flaws, right? No institution or bureaucracy is perfect, but the fact that 1,300 people may no longer be part of the city infrastructure is huge, right? No, the LAPD is not being asked to force anyone into retirement. And so, but for the civilian side of things, that's the hard choice. So I think we're supposed to find out in the next couple of months, which is a little nerve-wracking. And some of us are part of a union that is not necessarily keeping us abreast of things. And so I think that that's the other dynamic of it. But I mean, I think that as long as those of us who are interested in continuing to do the work, right, outside of our, who pays for our bills, I think it's going to be really important that we continue to do this work collectively, because I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments? Jamie, Alexis, folks who've, any closing comments from y'all? Everybody say something. All right. Well, cool. Well, so Virginia, Jane, Lex, do you all have any other comments, anything to share? Okay, all right, cool. Well, good. Well, I want to thank you really all very much for making the time for this conversation. I know that one last thing that we couldn't get to, but Gina, are you familiar? Can you, or maybe before we leave, because this is a very critical piece, that Measure J that the county's moving, because that's going to be a charter amendment in the county. So I know that that's going to be up for a vote, which will be transitioning, or which would be moving monies from the county, about $1 billion. Gina, do you know the details, or do you have details on that? If you want to unmute yourself.
I mean, I can give like a very layman's, I mean, I'm part of the committee working on it, but it is a ballot measure, and it's very thoughtfully written in that no monies can go through any legal entities at all. So it can't go through policing or the DA's office or any of that. So even though they're not using defund the police, that's essentially what's happening is, but it will essentially force the county to spend about $1 billion on the alternatives to incarceration and other care things that the county needs. So, you know, the coalition is working together now. There are 5 different working groups to get it passed, because it is going out to the county. But it is very much an extension of Measure R, in that Measure R, you know, originally said we want to invest in something other than jails, and we want more oversight for the sheriff. So now this is essentially what we want to invest in, alternatively to jails. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about it, since it is, to me, it's definitely the county leaping way over the city in terms of taking steps to do this. So, but being forced to by the people too as well. So.
I mean, I think to some extent, jurisdictionally, it makes some sense as well, because most of these are county departments, you know, just around Department of Children and Family Services and various other departments as well. So while there are city pieces too, so it'll be interesting to see how a city like LA in a county, which is such a large city compared to the other 84 or 85 cities that exist, what would that look like around the allocations? So I think that's where the real fight's going to begin. It's not, maybe it's what it's sometimes the caution is, where, you know, don't what you ask for, when you get it, now what are you going to do with that? So I think that's where the politics is going to begin. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But thank you, Gina. Thank you for sharing that. And this is a ballot on the November 3rd election, Measure J. So that's what's being floated. Well, thank you all very much. Want to just remind folks that our next Tuesday evening, which would be August 25th, is a meeting. Jamie, do you want to give us a quick preview as to what we should expect for that meeting?
Yeah, thanks, Hamid. So this is basically kind of like this meeting. We have a working group that meets the first Monday and the third Monday of the month. And then on this fourth Tuesday, we kind of present the work that we're doing. And this group is looking at the architecture of surveillance, so the various types of surveillance technology, and also unpacking more so location-based policing. And so we're working on a lot of different types of maps, kind of recreating what LAPD was doing when it was implementing Operation Laser, and how it was targeting different communities, targeting different homes and businesses. And we're visually recreating that, and actually have picked 4 different locations that we're going to start to unpack more about how the area around that location was changing in order to make it easier to police. So it's really looking at kind of like how land is coveted by either real estate, the city, and how policing comes in to change it so that it's easier for them to take it through either nuisance abatement, through evictions, or through making the space unbearable to live in. So, so we'll be looking at the architecture of surveillance and some deep dive work we've been doing in a public records request that we filed. And we'll also be kind of going through our maps and talking about that. And I'm trying to get a conversation going, because one of the deeper conversations we're having in that group is looking at settler colonialism. So as we talk about location-based policing and what that is, we want to center it in and ground it in the idea that settler colonialism is still very ever present, and the way that police facilitates that in working with a multitude of city agents to be able to remove people from land, and that being another form of police violence, not just seeing the violence of the baton or the gun, but actually seeing the violence of actually removing people from land as a component of police violence. So please, if you have time, we're here. We're going to be there next Tuesday at 6 p.m. and would love the conversation and would love the input and just direction, and if we're going down the right route in the work that we're doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. So in closing, I'm just going to channel Mariela here real quick, and who's asking just in closing, just let's all of us take a deep breath, a collective deep breath. Yes, and we are who we have been waiting for. So absolutely, and we are here. I mean, so we're standing on the shoulders of so many before us, and let's kick it up. Let's keep on fighting. Please stay healthy, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see some of you next Tuesday, or and some of you on the streets. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 See y'all.
Bye.